fine dust, like pulverized amber, drifted through the air of ZYLM. It coated everything. The abandoned structures that once housed a thriving civilization, the withered remnants of what might have been trees, and the small, squat research station where Julian Marr had spent the last 8 months of his life. The twin suns of this dying world hung like distant, fading embers in a perpetually hazy sky. One burned orange, the other a faint yellow, neither providing enough warmth to counteract the spreading chill that seemed to emanate from the planet's core itself. Julian stood at the viewport, watching another dust storm approach from the eastern horizon. The spectrometers would need to be adjusted again. The particulate matter was growing finer by the week, somehow more invasive. He sighed, rubbing his eyes with the heels of his palms. His reflection stared back at him. A man in his late 30s, face hollow with exhaustion, beard untrimmed, eyes that had seen too much and helped too little. The station hummed with mechanical efficiency around him. Machines taking readings, processing data, mapping the decline of ZYLM with scientific precision. That's what they were here for, after all. To document, to record, to witness the death of a planet without interfering. Non-intervention protocol. Julian muttered to himself, the words bitter on his tongue as he turned from the window and made his way to the monitoring station. The small room was cluttered with screens displaying atmospheric conditions, geological activity, radiation levels, all trending downward, all pointing to the same conclusion. ZYLM was dying, and they were merely its corners. He tapped a series of commands into the console, adjusting the calibration on the exterior sensors. A notification flashed briefly on the screen. Another automated message from Earth Central, requesting his bi-weekly report. Julian ignored it. The reports were all the same now. Continued planetary degradation. No significant changes in decline rate. Local population down to scattered nomadic groups. The local population, the Zilmians, humanoid, but distinctly alien with their violet-gray skin, elongated limbs, and those haunting, multifaceted eyes that seemed to reflect light from somewhere beyond the visible spectrum. Julian had observed them from a distance, through drones and long-range scanners. Protocol forbade direct contact. We are observers, his supervisor had emphasized during orientation, not saviors. What good was observing if it didn't lead to helping? The question had haunted Julian from the moment he'd accepted this assignment. But then, he hadn't come here to help. He'd come here to escape. Julian sank into the worn chair at his workstation and pulled up the satellite imagery from the Northern Highlands. A small cluster of vegetation still clung to existence there, though the images showed it browning at the edges. He zoomed in, counting the remaining specimens, noting their condition in his log. This was what his life had been reduced to, documenting the precise rate at which life vanished from ZYLM. The memory came unbidden, as it always did in moments of quiet reflection. A hospital corridor, antiseptic and bright. Running, breath burning in his lungs, feet pounding against polished floors. The room, numbers swimming before his eyes. 314. Too late. Always too late. His daughter's face, peaceful in death in a way it had never been during her illness. The machine silent at last. His wife's accusing stare. You should have been here. Julian blinked hard, pushing the memory away. He'd fled to the farthest assignment he could find after the divorce, after everything fell apart. And here he was, unable to save his daughter, now watching helplessly as an entire world faded into dust. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd failed on the most personal level, and now he was failing on a planetary scale, bound by rules and protocols that seemed increasingly meaningless in the face of extinction. A sharp, insistent beeping jerked him from his thoughts. The perimeter sensors. Something was moving outside the station's protective barrier. Probably just debris caught in the wind, but protocol required investigation of any anomaly. With a weary sigh, Julian pushed himself up from the chair and moved to the equipment locker. He pulled out the environmental suit, checking the seals and oxygen levels before stepping into it. The helmet locked with a pressurized hiss. The heads-up display flickering to life, showing him the exterior temperature, -7 degrees Celsius. Wind speed, 22 kilometers per hour, and air quality, dangerous as always. The airlock cycled with agonizing slowness. When the exterior door finally slid open, the wind immediately assaulted him, carrying with it that fine, pervasive dust. Julian activated his suit's exterior lights and scanned the perimeter. The sensors indicated movement to the northwest, about 50 meters from the station. He trudged forward, boots sinking slightly into the loose surface. The landscape was barren, a wasteland of dust and rocks stretching to the horizon, broken only by the occasional remnant of what might once have been a structure or a tree. In the early days, he'd found such explorations almost exciting, the novelty of an alien world, even a dying one. Now it was just another chore, another reminder of his impotence in the face of cosmic indifference. The sensor ping grew stronger as he approached a shallow ridge. Something was just beyond it, sheltering perhaps from the increasing wind. Julian climbed carefully, the suit's servos whining slightly with the effort. At the top, he stopped, frozen not by the cold but by what he saw. A figure knelt in the dust below, cloaked in tattered ceremonial fabric that might once have been richly colored but was now faded to dull browns and grays. Even huddled, Julian could tell the being was tall, with the distinctive elongated limbs of the Zilmians. Long, dark hair whipped around a face that was gaunt with exhaustion, the violet-gray skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. But it was what the figure held that made Julian's breath catch in his throat. A child, tiny even for a Zilmian infant, wrapped in a fabric that might once have been vibrant red but was now faded and worn. The baby was unnaturally still, only the slightest movement of its chest indicating life. The adult Zilmian's head snapped up at Julian's approach, those multifaceted eyes widening first in fear, then in desperate hope. With visible effort, the alien rose, cradling the infant with trembling arms. It took Julian a moment to realize the being was female. The differences were subtle, but unmistakable in the delicate structure of the face, the softer curve of the jaw. She staggered forward a step, then another, the wind buffeting her too thin frame. Julian remained frozen, protocol screaming in his mind. No contact. Observe only. Do not interfere. The Zilmian woman reached him, standing just beyond arm's length. Her lips parted, and to Julian's shock, she spoke in halting, accented English, a language some Zilmians had learned from monitoring human communications. My milk has dried up, human. Her voice cracked, a sound like breaking crystal. My baby hasn't eaten for days. The words hung between them, carried away by the howling wind, yet somehow embedding themselves in Julian's consciousness. The woman's eyes, so alien yet filled with an emotion Julian recognized all too well, pleaded with him. She extended her arms slightly, offering a better view of the infant. The baby's skin had a grayish cast to it, lacking the violet hue of health. Its breath came in shallow, irregular gasps. Julian's mind raced. The protocol was clear: no intervention, no matter the circumstances. Earth Central had been explicit. Humanity lacked the resources to save dying civilizations. The policy was to observe, document, learn, not to meddle in the natural course of extinction. His job, his future, his entire professional existence depended on maintaining that distance. Yet as he looked at the infant, memories of another child, his child, flooded back. The hospital room, the machines flatlining, the terrible, crushing knowledge that he'd been too late. Please, the woman whispered, a universal word of desperation. Protocol shattered. Julian reached out, gently touching the infant's forehead through his gloved hand. The baby was cold, too cold. Without another word, he gestured for the woman to follow him, turning back toward the station with a decisiveness that surprised even himself. The trek back seemed interminable. The woman stumbled several times, clearly at the limits of her endurance, but she refused Julian's offers to carry the child. Her fierce protectiveness transcended language barriers. By the time they reached the airlock, the dust storm was upon them in earnest, visibility reduced to mere meters. Inside, Julian quickly removed his helmet, then helped the woman to a seat in the decontamination chamber. Station protocols required all external material to be processed before entering the main complex, but Julian overrode the safety measures. The infant needed immediate attention. "My name Julian," he said, pointing to himself, speaking slowly. "You?" The woman looked up, still clutching her baby. "Omria," she replied, then gestured to the infant. "Carrie." Julian nodded, the name sending a pang through his heart, so similar to his own daughter's. He pushed the thought aside and focused on the immediate needs. "Carrie needs help," he said, miming eating and pointing to the baby. Omria nodded, a gesture apparently universal across species. She carefully unwrapped the infant, revealing a tiny form that seemed impossibly fragile. Carrie's eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. Julian moved quickly to the medical bay, a small but well-equipped room designed for the sole human inhabitant of the station. He rummaged through supplies, mind racing, through what little he knew of Zilmian physiology from the research files. Similar to humans in many ways, but with significant differences in nutritional needs and body chemistry. He settled on a basic electrolyte solution, diluted to reduce the risk of shock to the infant system. With trembling hands, he filled a small dropper. When he returned, Omria watched him with wary hope. "For Carrie," Julian explained, miming drinking. "Help," he demonstrated by placing a drop on his own tongue, then offered the dropper to Omria. Her hands shook as she took it, carefully placing a single drop on her baby's pale lips. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Carrie's tiny tongue emerged, licking at the moisture. Omria gave a soft cry, a sound of mingled relief and hope, as she administered another drop, then another. Julian stepped back, watching the scene with a tightness in his chest. He had broken the most fundamental rule of his assignment. If Earth Central discovered his actions, he would be recalled immediately, possibly face disciplinary action. Yet watching Carrie respond, seeing the desperate hope in Omria's eyes, he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. As Carrie continued to take the solution, Julian busied himself preparing a space for them. The station wasn't designed for visitors, but the small auxiliary lab could be converted to living quarters. He gathered blankets, set the environmental controls to what the file suggested would be comfortable for Zilmians, and try not to think about the consequences of his actions. By the time he returned, Carrie was more alert, her eyes, simpler than her mother's but still hauntingly alien, open and focusing on Omria's face. The baby's color seemed marginally improved, the grayish tinge slightly less pronounced. "Rest," Julian said, gesturing to the prepared room. "Safe here." Omria rose unsteadily, still cradling Carrie. She followed Julian to the auxiliary lab, her gaze taking in the unfamiliar surroundings with cautious curiosity. When she saw the makeshift bed, she turned to Julian, her expression conveying gratitude more effectively than words ever could. "Thank you," she said in her accented English. "We die without help." Julian swallowed hard. "Rest now," he repeated, pointing to the bed. "I make food for Carrie." As Omria settled onto the bed with her child, Julian retreated to the main laboratory. His hands moved automatically, preparing a more substantial nutrient solution that might serve as a milk substitute. The station's synthesizer could create basic proteins and carbohydrates, and Julian programmed it according to the limited data on Zilmian dietary needs. While the synthesizer worked, Julian checked the communication logs. There was a new message from Earth Central, a routine check-in, nothing more. No indication that they were aware of his breach of protocol. Not yet. Julian knew it was only a matter of time. The station's systems automatically logged all activities, and sooner or later, someone would notice the increased life support usage, the unscheduled airlock cycle, the synthesizer production. His violation would be discovered. For now, though, his priority was clear: keep Carrie alive. The synthesizer chimed, indicating the mixture was ready. Julian tested it for temperature and consistency before transferring it to a small bottle with a flexible nipple, designed for emergency use by colonists with infants. When he returned to the auxiliary lab, he found Omria sitting upright on the bed, her back against the wall, Carrie nestled against her chest. The Zilmian woman looked up as Julian entered, her eyes tracking his movement to the bedside. Julian demonstrated how to use the bottle, then carefully passed it to Omria. She examined it briefly before bringing it to Carrie's lips. The infant initially turned away, but Omria persisted, gently encouraging. After several attempts, Carrie began to suckle weakly. "Good," Julian said softly, relief washing over him as the baby continued to drink. "Good." Omria looked up at him, her alien features softening. "You have child?" she asked, the question startling Julian with its perceptiveness. He hesitated, the familiar pain rising in his chest. "Yes," he finally answered. "Had. Daughter. She. Gone." Understanding crossed Omria's face, an expression that transcended species boundaries. "Sorry," she said simply. Julian nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The parallels were too stark, too painful. Another dying child, another chance to act, but this time perhaps not too late. "Carrie will live," he said with more confidence than he felt. "I help." Omria nodded, her attention returning to her feeding child. Julian withdrew, giving them privacy, retreating to the monitoring station to process what he had done and what might come next. Hours later, as Julian was reviewing the latest atmospheric data, a sharp beeping cut through the quiet hum of the station. A priority message from Earth. Central flagged urgent. Julian's stomach knotted as he opened the communication. Unauthorized life signs detected at station ZY7. Explain immediately. Reminder. Non-intervention protocol is absolute. Extraction team dispatched. Eta iruroeita amabios. Julian stared at the message, a cold dread settling over him. He had expected this, of course, but not so soon. The extraction team would remove him from the station, return him to Earth for disciplinary action. And Omria and Carrie would be left to die on a planet that could no longer sustain them. He couldn't allow that. Julian's fingers hovered over the keyboard. There was a protocol for emergencies, for situations where communications needed to be temporarily suspended due to external interference. It had never been needed before, but Julian knew the codes, knew how to implement it. It would buy him time, not much, but perhaps enough. He entered the commands, triggering the emergency communication lockdown. The system protested briefly, demanding confirmation codes and reason codes, all of which Julian provided with mechanical efficiency. Finally, the screen flashed. Emergency protocol engaged. Communications suspended. Duration, 96 hours. For days. It wasn't much, but might be enough to stabilize Carrie, to find a more permanent solution for Omria. Julian couldn't save the planet, but perhaps he could save these 2 lives. He made his way back to the auxiliary lab, finding Omria awake, her eyes reflecting the dim light of the room. Carrie slept in her arms, breathing more steadily now. "We have problem," Julian said simply, sitting on the edge of the bed. "My people come soon. They take me away. They not help you." Omria tensed, her arms tightening protectively around Carrie. Why? How could he explain the complex political and economic factors that had led to Earth's non-intervention policy? The resource limitations, the ethical debates, the cold calculations that had determined that dying civilizations were to be studied, not saved? "Rules," he said finally, inadequately. "Bad rules. I broke them for you, for Carrie. No regret. But my people come in 3 days." "We go," Omria said, her voice firm despite her weakness. "Back to dust." Julian shook his head vehemently. "No, I help you find safe place. There must be somewhere." He trailed off, thinking of the satellite imagery, the endless waste of Zolem's surface. Was there anywhere on this dying planet that could sustain life for more than a few weeks? "Village cast us out," Omria said quietly, her gaze lowering to Carrie. "When milk stopped. Bad omen, they say. Child must die if mother's milk fails. Old belief." Her voice held a bitter edge. "I refused. Left before they could take her." Julian felt a surge of anger at the cruelty of such a belief, followed quickly by shame at his own species' indifference. Who was he to judge, when humanity had written off an entire planet. "We find new place," he insisted. Together, that night, as Omria and Carrie slept, Julian pored over the satellite data, searching for any anomaly, any sign of sustainable conditions. The northern highlands still showed traces of vegetation, but they were remote, difficult to reach, with no shelter from the increasingly violent storms. He was about to give up when he noticed something on the eastern boundary of the mapped region, a small structure, partially obscured by dust, but with signs of active energy signatures. It didn't match the architecture of the abandoned Zilmian cities, nor did it have the distinct profile of a human research station. Julian enhanced the image, running it through various filters. The structure appeared to be a dome of some kind, possibly a sealed environment. Its power signature was weak, but stable, suggesting some kind of sustainable system. It was approximately 3 days' journey from the station on foot, a dangerous trek across exposed terrain, but potentially their only option, as dawn broke, painting the dusty landscape in shades of amber and bronze. Julian presented his findings to Omria. She studied the images with those complex, faceted eyes, then nodded slowly. "I know this place," she said, surprising Julian. "Old stories tell of it. The Green Dome, built by ancestors when planet first sickened. Most thought it myth." Hope stirred in Julian's chest. "It's real, and it has power. It might have plants, water." Omria looked down at Carrie, who was awake and more alert than Julian had yet seen her. The infant's color had improved significantly, the violet hue more pronounced in her skin. "We go," Omria decided. Julian spent the day preparing. He gathered portable water filters, emergency rations, medical supplies, and thermal blankets. He adapted a carrier for Carrie that would allow Omria to keep the baby close while protecting her from the dust. He programmed the station's systems to continue the emergency lockdown protocol for the maximum duration. And he tried not to think about what he was leaving behind. His career, certainly. Possibly his freedom, if Earth Central decided his actions warranted severe punishment. But for the first time since his daughter's death, Julian felt something other than numbing grief and guilt. He felt purpose. They set out at dusk, when the twin suns were low on the horizon and the worst of the day's heat had dissipated. Julian wore his environmental suit, while Omria was wrapped in layers of modified station linens, a breathing filter covering her nose and mouth. Carrie was secured against her mother's chest, protected by a transparent shield that allowed her to breathe filtered air. The landscape stretched before them, desolate and unforgiving. The dust, ever present, swirled around their feet with each step. Julian checked his portable navigation system, confirming their heading toward the mysterious dome. "Stay close," he instructed Omria. "Storm come quickly here." They walked in silence for hours, the only sounds their footsteps and the occasional whistle of wind through rocky outcroppings. As night deepened, the temperature plummeted, forcing them to huddle together beneath an overhanging cliff face, sharing the thermal blankets. Carrie fussed quietly, and Julian prepared another bottle of the nutrient solution, which Omria fed to her with increasing confidence. "Why you help us?" Omria asked as they sat in the dim light of Julian's emergency lamp. "Break rules? Risk punishment?" Julian was quiet for a long moment, watching Carrie's tiny hands grasp at the bottle. "My daughter," he finally said, "similar to Carrie. She's sick, very sick. I work far away. Come home too late. She died before I see her." The words were stilted, simplified for Omria's limited English, but the pain behind them needed no elaborate expression. "You not there," Omria said, understanding. "You carry this pain." Julian nodded, surprised at how easily this alien woman had grasped the core of his grief. "I fail her. I not fail Carrie." Omria reached out, her long, slender fingers touching Julian's hand briefly. "You good father," she said simply. "To my Carrie now." The words struck Julian with unexpected force, bringing a sting of tears to his eyes. He blinked them away, focusing on adjusting the settings of the emergency lamp to conserve power. "Sleep," he said. "Long walk tomorrow." Dawn brought a new challenge, a dust storm approaching from the west, visible as a towering wall of amber on the horizon. Julian estimated they had perhaps 2 hours before it reached them, and there was no substantial shelter in sight. "We move fast," he told Amria, who nodded grimly, securing Carrie more tightly against her chest. They increased their pace, Julian constantly checking the navigation system. They needed to reach a range of low hills before the storm hit, the only potential shelter in their path. Amria moved with determined grace despite her exhaustion, her focus entirely on protecting Carrie. The wind began to pick up, carrying the first stinging particles of dust. Julian checked the filter on Amria's mask, ensuring it was still functioning properly. Carrie's protective shield remained clear, but the infant was becoming distressed, perhaps sensing the approaching danger. The hills were tantalizingly close when the storm hit with unexpected ferocity. Visibility dropped to mere feet, the air thick with choking dust. Julian grabbed Amria's hand, guiding her forward. "Almost there," he shouted over the howling wind. "Keep moving." They stumbled onward, the navigation system now their only guide in the blinding storm. Julian felt Amria falter beside him, her steps becoming unsteady. "Can't breathe," she gasped. Dust filter failing. Julian looked at her in alarm. The filter was indeed clogging with the fine particles, far faster than it should have. Without hesitation, he removed his helmet and placed it over Amria's head, adjusting it to create as tight a seal as possible around her alien features. "You need," she protested, her voice muffled. "Carrie needs you," Julian replied, pulling his collar up over his nose and mouth. It was poor protection, but it would have to do. "Keep moving." The dust scorched his lungs with each breath, his eyes watering and burning despite the protective goggles he still wore. But he drove them forward, one step at a time, until finally the ground began to slope upward. They were reaching the hills. Julian searched desperately for any depression, any overhang that might offer shelter. There, a narrow crevice in the hillside, barely visible in the swirling dust. He pulled Amria toward it, relief flooding through him as they squeezed into the opening and found themselves in a small, natural cave. The relative stillness after the roaring storm was disorienting. Julian collapsed against the stone wall, coughing violently, his lungs fighting to expel the dust he'd inhaled. Amria removed the helmet with shaking hands, passing it back to him with, "Urgen gesturas." "Breathe," she insisted. "Please." Julian accepted the helmet gratefully, taking several deep breaths of filtered air before removing it again. "Check Carrie," he said between coughs. Amria carefully unlocked the protective shield, revealing Carrie's face. The infant's eyes were closed, her breathing alarmingly shallow. "Something wrong," Amria said, fear evident in her voice. "Not breathing right." Julian moved closer, examining Carrie with increasingly desperate focus. The baby's airway seemed clear, but her breathing was becoming more labored. Dust had somehow penetrated the shield, perhaps through a small breach in the seal. "Need to help her breathe," Julian said, reaching for the medical kit. He extracted a small device, a pediatric respiratory assist tool, designed for emergency use. It consisted of a tiny mask connected to a manual air pump, scaled for human infants, but adaptable. "Hold her steady," Julian instructed, fitting the mask over Carrie's nose and mouth. It was too large, designed for human proportions, but Julian used medical tape to improve the seal. Then he began to gently pump the air, supplementing Carrie's struggling breaths. Amria watched with terrified focus, her hands shaking as they held Carrie still. Time stretched, measured only by the rhythmic compression of the air pump and Carrie's irregular breaths. After what seemed like hours, but was likely only minutes, Carrie's breathing began to strengthen. Her eyes fluttered open, focusing briefly on Julian before shifting to her mother's face. Amria made a sound that transcended language, pure maternal relief. She gathered Carrie close, whispering words in her native tongue that needed no translation. Julian sat back, exhaustion overwhelming him. The dust storm continued to rage outside their shelter, likely to last for hours yet. They were safe for the moment, But the ordeal had taken its toll on all of them, particularly on Amria, who, despite her stoic demeanor, was clearly at the limits of her strength. Rest, Julian urged her. I watch. Amria hesitated, then nodded, curling around Carrie in a protective embrace. Within minutes, both were asleep, their breathing synchronized in the quiet of the cave. Julian kept vigil, monitoring the storm through the cave entrance, checking on Carrie periodically. The infant's breathing remained stable, a small miracle given the conditions they had endured. As he watched Amria and Carrie sleep, Julian was struck by how quickly they had become important to him, how fiercely he now wanted them to survive. It was more than guilt over his daughter, more than a desire for redemption. In this dying world, these two lives had become a focal point of hope, a reason to continue when everything else seemed futile. The storm subsided gradually, the howling wind diminishing to a low moan, then to silence broken only by the occasional gust. Julian checked the navigation system. The dome was still approximately a day's journey away, assuming no further delays. Amria stirred, waking with the alertness of someone accustomed to danger. Her first action was to check Carrie, her relief visible when she found the infant still breathing steadily. Storm gone, she asked, her voice hoarse. Almost, Julian confirmed. We wait little longer, then continue. Amria nodded, then hesitated. Julian, she said slowly, as if choosing her words with care. If don't not safe, or not real. Julian understood the question she couldn't quite formulate. We find another way, he promised. I not leave you. The remainder of their journey was a blur of exhaustion, determination, and brief moments of connection. They traversed barren plains where the dust was so deep it reached their knees, requiring Julian to carry Amria for stretches when her strength failed. They scaled low ridges, the sharp rocks cutting through their improvised footwear. They rationed water with increasing strictness, the supply dwindling faster than Julian had anticipated. Through it all, Carrie showed remarkable resilience. The infant's condition continued to improve, her eyes more alert, her cries stronger. Amria, despite her own suffering, maintained a fierce focus on her child's needs, singing soft, alien lullabies when Carrie grew restless. It was during one of their brief rest periods, as Julian administered another antibiotic dose to prevent infection from the dust in Carrie's lungs, that Amria spoke of her home. Our village once beautiful, she said, gazing out at the wasteland before them. Trees with silver leaves. Lakes so clear, sea bottom. Children play in water. She sighed, a sound tinged with generations of loss. All gone before my birth. Parents tell stories only. Julian tried to imagine Zi-Lem as it might once have been. Verdant, thriving, filled with a complex culture that now existed only in fragments among the surviving nomadic groups. When planets started dying, he asked, Amria's expression became distant. Many generations. Slow death. Some say punishment from gods. Some say natural cycle. Some blame stars. She looked at Julian. Your people no reason? Julian hesitated. The truth was complex and not entirely understood, even by Earth scientists. A combination of factors, orbital shifts, solar fluctuations, possibly exacerbated by the Zilmians' own industrial development before they understood its consequences. Many reasons, he said finally. Not one cause. Not punishment. Amria nodded, seeming satisfied with this answer. Elders say otherwise. Say children born when mother's milk fails are cursed. Bring more death. Her arms tightened around Carrie. I not believe. Carrie innocent. Elders wrong. Julian said firmly. Carrie is hope. They continued their journey as the second sun began to set, casting long, purple shadows across the landscape. Julian checked the navigation system again. They were close now, within a few kilometers of the dome's coordinates. But fatigue was taking its toll. Amria stumbled frequently, and Julian's own vision was beginning to blur with exhaustion. There, Amria said suddenly, pointing to a faint outline on the horizon. See it? Julian squinted, focusing on where she indicated. At first, He saw nothing but the usual desolation. Then, as his eyes adjusted, he discerned a curved structure, half buried in dust, but distinctly artificial. "The dome," he breathed. "We found it." Their pace quickened despite their exhaustion, hope providing a final surge of energy. As they drew closer, details emerged. The dome was indeed partially submerged in the accumulated dust of years, perhaps decades, but its upper portion remained intact. The material was unlike anything Julian had seen before. Not quite glass, not quite metal, with a faint iridescence that caught the dying light. At the base, barely visible, was what appeared to be an entrance, a circular portal set into the curve of the dome. Julian approached cautiously, Omria close behind him, Carrie silent in her arms, as if sensing the importance of the moment. The door had no obvious handle or control panel. Julian examined it closely, running his hands over the smooth surface. To his surprise, the material warmed at his touch, and a seam appeared where none had been visible before. The door slid open silently, revealing a dark interior. Julian activated his suit's lights, illuminating a narrow corridor that led deeper into the dome. The air that wafted out was noticeably different, less dust, a hint of moisture, and something else, something Julian had almost forgotten in his months on ZYLM, the scent of living plants. "Come," he said to Omria, leading the way inside. The corridor opened into a vast central chamber that took Julian's breath away. The dome's interior was a self-contained ecosystem, small, strained, but undeniably alive. Terrace gardens spiraled upward along the inner curve of the dome, filled with plants unlike any Julian had seen. Some reminiscent of Earth's ferns, but with a metallic sheen to their leaves. Others more like succulents with translucent, water-storing tissues. At the center, a small pool collected moisture that appeared to be recycled through a complex system of pipes and filters. "The green dome," Omria whispered, awe in her voice. "Not myth." Carrie, perhaps sensing the change in the air, let out a sound Julian hadn't heard before, a small, bubbling laugh. The infant's arms reached toward the greenery, fingers stretching as if to touch the vibrant life around them. Julian moved further into the chamber, examining the technology that maintained this oasis. It was sophisticated yet clearly designed for sustainability. Solar collectors, water reclamation systems, air purifiers that worked in harmony with the plants themselves. Whoever had built this had intended it to last. "Who make this?" he asked Omria, who was gently allowing Carrie to touch a low-hanging frond, the baby's expression one of wonder. "Ancestors," Omria replied. "When they see planet dying, build arks. Most fail." She looked around, her alien eyes reflecting the green surrounding them. This one survived. Julian continued his exploration, finding sleeping areas built into the walls, storage compartments containing preserved foods and seeds, even basic medical supplies designed for Zilmian physiology. The dome had been created as a refuge, a place where life could continue even as the planet around it died. "We stay here," Julian said, the decision forming with absolute clarity. "Safe for Carrie. For you." Omria looked at him, a question in her expression. "You stay too." Julian hesitated. The extraction team would be searching for him now, the emergency communication lockdown having bought them only a brief reprieve. If he returned to Earth, he would face disciplinary action, possibly imprisonment for violating the non-intervention protocol. But if he stayed? Yes, he said finally, the word carrying the weight of all he was leaving behind and all he might gain. "I stay." Omria's expression softened, something like a smile transforming her alien features. She stepped closer to Julian, Carrie cradled between them, and placed one slender hand against his chest, over his heart. "We live," she said simply. Together, they spent the next hours exploring their new home, discovering its systems and resources. The dome was remarkably self-sufficient, with sophisticated filtration that extracted water from the atmosphere and recirculated it through the ecosystem. Solar collectors embedded in the dome's exterior gathered what little energy filtered through ZLM's dusty atmosphere. The plants, specially engineered for resilience, produced oxygen and processed carbon dioxide with heightened efficiency. Julian found a control panel hidden within one wall, its interface alien but decipherable with careful experimentation. From it, he could monitor the dome's life support systems, power usage, and environmental conditions. Everything was functioning, though it reduced capacity after years, perhaps decades, of automated operation. Amazing technology, Julian murmured, more to himself than to Omria, who was settling Carrie into a nest-like structure that seemed designed for infants. Built to last. Omria joined him at the panel, her eyes studying the unfamiliar displays. Ancestors wise, she said. No end coming. Prepare. She touched a symbol on the screen, and the lighting in the dome shifted subtly, becoming warmer. Remember how? Julian looked at her in surprise. You understand this? Omria nodded. Stories passed down. Songs teach how to use old things. She gestured around them. Sacred knowledge. For survivors. Julian felt a profound respect for this civilization that, even in its decline, had preserved such critical information through oral tradition. It was far more sophisticated than many of his colleagues had believed. The Zilmians had been dismissed as a dying species, regressing to primitive nomadism. But here was evidence of their foresight and resilience. As night fell outside the dome, its interior maintained a gentle illumination from bioluminescent plants that activated with the darkness. Carrie was sleeping peacefully for the first time since Julian had met her, her breathing even and strong. Omria had bathed in the central pool, washing away the dust of their journey, and now sat beside her daughter, her long hair damp and gleaming in the blue-green light. Julian found himself studying her with new awareness. In the harsh environment outside, he had seen only her desperation and determination. Here, in this sanctuary, he could appreciate the grace of her movements, the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet dignity she maintained even after all she had endured. You are watching, Omria observed, without looking up from Carrie. Julian smiled faintly. Sorry, just thinking. About what? About choices, Julian replied. About finding purpose again. Omria turned to face him fully. You lost purpose when daughter died? The directness of the question might have been jarring from another human, but from Omria, it felt natural, an honest inquiry without judgment. Yes, Julian admitted. Everything seemed empty, meaningless. So I came here to watch another death. The irony wasn't lost on him. Instead, I found life to protect. Omria considered this, her head tilting slightly in a gesture Julian was beginning to recognize as contemplation. Life's strange path, she said finally. My people say, when one river dries, water finds new channel. The wisdom in her words struck Julian deeply. That was exactly what had happened. His life's course had been altered by tragedy, but perhaps it had led him exactly where he needed to be. They ate a simple meal from the dome stores, nutrient-rich paste that tasted vaguely of nuts and herbs to Julian, though Omria seemed to find it familiar and satisfying. As they ate, she told him more about her people's history, about the beliefs that had led to her exile, about her hopes for Carrie. In old times, she explained, mother's milk sacred. Failing means child rejected by planet itself. She looked down at Carrie with fierce protectiveness. Foolish belief. From fear. My milk dried because food scarce, water bad. Not Carrie's fault. On my world, Julian offered, we have medicine, technology to help when mother's milk fails. Many children grow strong without it. Omria nodded. Wise. Life adapts. She hesitated, then asked, your world still lives? Still green? Julian thought of Earth, troubled, overcrowded, facing its own environmental challenges, but still vibrant with life. Yes, he said, still living, still fighting to survive. Will your people come here? Take dome technology? Help ZYLM? The question carried such hope that Julian felt a pang of guilt. No, he said gently. My people, they have rules. They believe each world must find its own path. They watch, learn, but do not interfere. He gestured around them. This dome, your ancestors built this. Your people's knowledge. not for humans to take or give. Omria absorbed this, disappointment visible in her expression, but also understanding. Your rule's wrong, she said simply, but you broke them. For us. For you, Julian confirmed. For Carrie. Some rules worth breaking. The night deepened around the dome, the howling winds of another dust storm audible but distant, unable to penetrate their sanctuary. Julian set up a sleeping area for himself near the control panel, wanting to monitor the systems through the night. Omria and Carrie settled in the nest-like structure, which seemed to regulate temperature automatically for optimal comfort. Before sleeping, Omria approached Julian one last time. Without words, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his, a gesture both alien and intimately familiar, a connection that transcended their differences. Then she returned to Carrie, leaving Julian with a warmth he had not felt in years. Julian slept deeply for the first time since arriving on ZYLM, his dreams untroubled by memories or guilt. He woke to the soft sounds of Carrie's babbling and Omria's gentle responses in her native language, a musical series of sounds unlike anything in human speech. The dome's interior was bathed in the diffuse light of morning, filtered through the iridescent material and scattered into rainbow patterns across the terrace gardens. Julian watched as Omria held Carrie up to touch the leaves of a fern-like plant, the infant's delighted reaction drawing a laugh from her mother. It was a moment of such simple joy, such normality in the midst of a dying world, that Julian felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was what he had saved, not just lives, but the capacity for happiness, for discovery, for connection. He approached them, smiling as Carrie turned at his footsteps, the baby's alien features somehow expressing recognition. "Morning," he said. "She looks strong today." Omria nodded, pride evident in her posture. "Grows stronger every hour. Dome air good for her." She indicated the plants around them. Showed her green. First time she sees. Julian reached out, gently touching Carrie's tiny hand. The infant grasped his finger with surprising strength, those alien eyes fixed on his face with what seemed like curiosity. "She knows you," Omria said. "Knows you saved her." Julian shook his head. "We saved her. Together." As the days passed, they established a routine within the dome. Julian worked on improving the efficiency of the life support systems, making adjustments based on Omria's knowledge of the traditional songs and his own scientific understanding. Omria tended the plants, knowing instinctively which needed more water, which should be harvested, which were ready to propagate. Carrie thrived in the controlled environment. Her color deepened to a healthy violet. Her movements became more coordinated, and her vocalizations more complex. Julian found himself fascinated by her development, documenting her progress with the same scientific precision he had once applied to tracking ZYLM's decline, but now with hope rather than resignation. They didn't speak of the future beyond the dome, of the extraction team that might still be searching for Julian, of the planet that continued to die around their small oasis. Instead, they focused on the present, on making their sanctuary as sustainable as possible, on teaching Carrie, on learning from each other. One evening, as they sat beside the central pool watching Carrie play with a makeshift toy Julian had crafted from spare components, Omria asked the question that had perhaps been inevitable. "Julian," she began, her English having improved significantly through their daily conversations, "if your people find us, what happens?" Julian had considered this question many times since their arrival at the dome. The truth was he didn't know. Earth Central might simply recall him for disciplinary action, leaving Omria and Carrie to their fate. Or they might view his actions as so egregious that they would forcibly remove him, possibly destroying the dome in the process if they believed it contained classified human technology. "Not sure," he admitted, "but I think they may have stopped looking. Emergency protocol showed station abandoned. Maybe they think I died in storm." Omria studied him, those faceted eyes seeming to perceive more than his words conveyed. "You hope they think you dead?" Julian nodded slowly. "Yes. Easier that way. For everyone. You had other life. Before us. Family? Friends. The question stirred memories Julian had kept at bay. His ex-wife, colleagues, the remnants of a life shattered by grief and guilt. Had he confirmed? Not now. Lost when daughter died. Omria moved closer to him, her slender form settling beside his with the fluid grace characteristic of her species. Now you have us, she said simply. New family. The word family resonated through Julian like a bell, awakening yearnings he had buried beneath layers of scientific detachment and emotional numbness. Was that what they had become? A family, forged in the crucible of survival, transcending the boundaries of species and origin? Yes, he said, the single word containing all he couldn't articulate. Family. Omria's hand found his, those long fingers intertwining with his own in a gesture that bridged their anatomical differences. In the gentle light of the dome, with Carrie's soft vocalizations creating a soundtrack to the moment, Julian felt something he had thought forever lost to him: peace. Weeks passed, then months. The dome continued to sustain them, its systems maintaining the delicate balance required for their survival. Outside, the dust storms grew more frequent, more violent, evidence of Zualem's continuing deterioration. But within their sanctuary, life flourished. Carrie began to walk, her first uncertain steps supported by both Julian and Omria, each holding one of her hands as she navigated the terrace gardens. She learned words from both languages, creating a unique hybrid of human English and Zilmian that only her parents understood completely. Julian thought of them that way now, as parents sharing the responsibility and joy of raising this child together. The distinction between human and alien had faded in importance, overshadowed by the bonds they had formed. One night, as Carrie slept and the dome hummed with its quiet maintenance routines, Omria joined Julian at the viewing portal he had constructed near the apex of the dome. Through it, they could see the twin suns setting, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. Beautiful, Omria said softly, even now. Julian followed her gaze to the horizon, where the dying suns painted the dust clouds in shades of amber and crimson. Yes, he agreed. Beautiful in its way. Omria leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, a gesture she had adopted from observing human affection in Julian's data archives. Julian, she said, her voice hesitant, I want to tell you something. Something important in my culture. Julian turned to face her, sensing the significance of the moment. Tell me, among my people, when we choose a life partner, we share a truth that no other knows. Her eyes held his, those alien depths somehow conveying emotions Julian recognized perfectly. My truth is, I fear dying alone, more than death itself. Finding you, it was like finding a path when lost in storm. The vulnerability in her admission touched Julian deeply. Without conscious thought, he reached up to trace the curve of her cheek, feeling the subtle differences in texture that marked her as not human, yet finding them beautiful, familiar. My truth, he responded, understanding the ritual without being told, is that I came to Zywilem to watch death because I thought I deserved punishment for failing my daughter. But you and Carrie showed me life is stronger than guilt. That love can grow in the most unlikely places. Omria's eyes glistened with moisture. Tears, Julian realized, were universal. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his in that now familiar gesture of connection. But this time, she shifted slightly, bringing her lips to his in a kiss that was both alien and perfect. When they parted, no words were necessary. They had forged something new between them, not human, not Zilmian, but uniquely their own. A bond as resilient as the dome that sheltered them, as unexpected as the life they had created together on this dying world. The next morning, they awoke to Carrie's excited babbling. The child had climbed to the highest terrace of the garden and was pointing at something beyond the dome's transparent sections. Julian hurried to join her, lifting her into his arms to better see what had captured her attention. Outside, a rare phenomenon was occurring. One of Ualem's infrequent rains, the water droplets heavy with dust, creating a misty curtain that softened the harsh landscape. Rain, Julian explained to Carrie. Water from sky. Omria joined them, her expression one of wonder. Not seen rain since child myself, she said. Good omen in old beliefs. They stood together, watching the brief shower transform the world outside momentarily. The dust was tamped down, revealing hints of the rocky surface beneath. For a fleeting instant, Julian could imagine how ZYLM might have looked before its decline, the potential that had once existed here. Will ZYLM die completely? Omria asked, voicing the question that had lingered unspoken between them. Julian considered his answer carefully. The scientific data was unequivocal. ZYLM's environmental collapse had passed the point of no return. The planet would continue its slow spiral into uninhabitability. But that was only one truth. The planet is changing, he said. Finally. But life finds ways to continue. The dome proves that. Carrie proves that. He looked at Omria, at their child. We prove that. Omria nodded, understanding what he was really saying. ZYLM, as it had been, was ending. But in this small pocket of resistance, something endured, not just survival, but living with purpose and love. As the rain ceased and the dust began to rise again outside their sanctuary, Julian felt no regret for the choices that had brought him here. He had come to ZYLM to document death, to punish himself with the futility of observation. Instead, he had found reasons to act, to help, to love. Carrie squirmed in his arms, reaching toward a small flowering plant that had begun to bloom in the uppermost terrace. Julian set her down, watching as she carefully approached the delicate purple blossoms with the reverence only a child can show for new discoveries. Omria slipped her hand into his, their fingers intertwining in what had become their natural way of connecting. Our child, she said softly. Our home. Julian squeezed her hand gently in acknowledgement. Outside, the dust swirled and the planet continued its slow decline. But here, within their fragile dome, 3 lives had formed a constellation of hope. Unexpected, improbable, but undeniably real. As Carrie's laughter echoed through the dome, Julian knew that they faced an uncertain future. The dome systems would eventually require parts they couldn't fabricate. Resources would become scarcer. The challenges would multiply as ZYLM deteriorated further. But they would face those challenges together, human and Zilmian, united by something stronger than the forces tearing the planet apart. They had created a family where none should have been possible, found love in the midst of extinction, built hope from the materials of despair. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.